I needed a break from everything: work, people, the constant noise of the city. I had always liked the idea of being alone in nature, away from the stress of everyday life. So, I rented a small cabin deep in the Montana woods for a quiet, week-long writing retreat. It was exactly what I needed. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere. There were no other houses nearby, no cell service, no Wi-Fi, just trees stretching out in every direction. The nearest town was over an hour away. The rental listing had described it as perfect for a peaceful getaway. That was exactly what I wanted. The owner, a man named Robert, met me at the edge of a long dirt road to give me the keys. He was in his late 50s, with a weathered face and rough hands. "Hope you like the quiet," he said with a small smile. I assured him that I did. "There's a radio in the cabin if you need to call for help," he added. "It's old, but it works. Other than that, you're on your own out here." I nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. Being alone in the woods sounded peaceful. I didn't think about the fact that it also meant no help if something went wrong. The cabin was small but cozy. It had a fireplace, a tiny kitchen, and one bedroom with a big window that faced the forest. There was no electricity, but I had brought battery-powered lanterns and plenty of food. I planned to spend my time writing, reading, and enjoying the silence. For the first few hours, everything was perfect. I made myself some tea, sat by the window, and started working on my book. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees was relaxing. The sun set early, and by 8 p.m., the forest outside was completely dark. I locked the front door and got into bed. I wasn't scared, just aware of how alone I was. There was no noise except for the occasional creaking of the wooden cabin and the distant hoot of an owl. At around 2 a.m., I woke up. Something had pulled me out of my sleep, but I didn't know what. I lay still listening. The cabin was silent. But then, a soft tapping sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window. I turned my head slowly, my heart pounding. Outside, just beyond the glass, was a dark figure. It was a man. He was standing right outside my bedroom window, facing me. He wasn't moving. He wasn't holding a flashlight. He was just standing there, staring in. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. Then I moved. I reached for my phone out of instinct, but of course, there was no service. My hands were shaking. The man didn't move. His face was hidden in the shadows, but I could see the outline of his head and shoulders. He was tall, maybe 6 feet or more. Tap, tap. The sound of his fingers lightly hitting the glass. I didn't know what to do. If I ran outside, he could grab me. If I stayed inside, I was trapped. I reached for the flashlight next to my bed and flicked it on, shining it directly at the window. And just like that, he was gone. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't see where he went. 1 second he was there, and the next, the window was empty. I sat there frozen, my heart beating so hard it hurt. I wanted to believe it had been a dream. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe my tired brain had turned a shadow into a person. But I knew what I had seen. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat up in bed, holding the flashlight, jumping at every small noise outside. By morning, I convinced myself it had been nothing. Maybe some hunter had gotten lost and seen the cabin lights. Maybe it was just a weird one-time thing. Then, I went outside. That's when I saw the footprints. They were in the dirt, clear as day. Large boot prints. They started at the tree line and led straight to my bedroom window. But there was something worse. The footprints didn't just stop at my window. They circled the entire cabin. Whoever had been outside had walked around the cabin, stopping at every single window. I felt sick. Who had been out here? What did they want? I grabbed my bag, shoved my things inside, and locked the cabin behind me. I didn't even bother checking the radio. I got into my car and drove as fast as I could back to town. I found Robert, the cabin owner, at the gas station and told him everything. He didn't look surprised. "You're not the first," he said, shaking his head. I stared at him. "What do you mean?" "People keep seeing him." My stomach dropped. "Who?" Robert sighed. "We don't know." He went on to explain that other renters had seen the same figure over the years, a tall man standing outside at night watching. Some people had heard tapping on the windows. Others had found footprints circling the cabin, just like I had. But no one had ever caught him. No one knew who he was. The police had come out before, but never found anything. "They think it's just some drifter passing through," Robert said. "But it's been happening for years." I didn't care who it was. I just knew I was never coming back. I drove straight home, not stopping until I was hours away from that place. To this day, I still don't know who that man was. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I remember the sound. Tap, tap, and I wonder if he's still out there, standing in the dark, watching. Work was stressing me out, my apartment felt too small, and I just wanted some peace and quiet. So, I booked a cabin in the Adirondacks for a weekend. It was supposed to be a simple, relaxing trip, just me, the forest, and a few books. The listing described the cabin as cozy and rustic, perfect for a quiet retreat. It was owned by an older man named Henry. He was friendly when I arrived, but there was something strange about the way he spoke. "You're gonna love it out here," he said, handing me the key. No noise, no neighbors, just nature. That was exactly what I wanted. As I was about to leave, he hesitated. Then, in a more serious tone, he added, "Oh, one more thing. There's a locked door in the hallway. Don't try to open it." I frowned. "What's inside?" He shook his head. "Just storage. Not important. Just don't bother with it, all right?" I nodded slowly, a little confused, but I didn't ask any more questions. The cabin was small but nice. There was a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a bedroom with a big window facing the trees. I set my bags down and explored the place. Then I saw the door. It was at the end of the hallway, slightly different from the other doors. It was older, with a heavy brass handle. There was no keyhole, just a simple latch that had been locked from the outside. I felt a small chill as I stood there. Something about it felt wrong. I shook off the feeling and reminded myself that it was just a storage room. Nothing weird about that. The rest of the evening was peaceful. I cooked some food, read for a while, and sat by the fireplace, enjoying the quiet. Around 11 p.m., I decided to get some sleep. That's when I heard the first noise. It was soft, almost too quiet to notice at first. A light shuffling sound, like something moving behind the locked door. I froze. I listened carefully, holding my breath. The sound stopped. I told myself it was just the house settling. Old cabins made noises sometimes. I forced myself to ignore it, got into bed, and eventually fell asleep. The next day was uneventful. I went for a hike, took some pictures, and spent most of the afternoon reading outside on the porch. But in the back of my mind, I kept thinking about the locked door. By the time night fell, I had convinced myself that I needed to check it. Maybe just knock. Just to prove to myself that it was really just storage. I stood in front of the door, hesitating. Then I knocked. At first, there was nothing. Just silence. Then, from the other side, knock, knock. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. It had been faint, almost like an echo of my own knock. But I knew what I had heard. I backed away slowly, trying to breathe. Maybe there's an animal trapped inside, I told myself. Maybe a raccoon or a stray cat got in somehow. I considered calling Henry, but I had no cell service. The only way to reach him was to drive back to town, and I wasn't about to leave the cabin in the middle of the night. I decided to wait until morning. I went to bed, but I didn't sleep well. Every time I started to drift off, I imagined something standing behind that door listening. By morning, I was feeling ridiculous. It was just a locked room. There was no reason to be afraid of a door. But something about it didn't sit right with me. I went outside to check the exterior of the cabin, looking for a window or any sign of another entrance to the locked room. But there was nothing. The room didn't have a window. From the outside, it didn't even seem like there should be a room there at all. The cabin was too small for an extra space. That didn't make sense. I spent most of the day trying to ignore my growing anxiety. I read, cooked dinner, and tried to act normal. By the time night came, I had made a decision. I was going to open the door. It was almost midnight when I finally stood in front of it. I took a deep breath, placed my hand on the latch, and pulled. It didn't open. The latch was locked tight. I hesitated, then pushed harder. Still locked. I needed something to force it open. I grabbed a screwdriver from my bag and wedged it into the gap between the door and the frame. I twisted, trying to loosen the latch. Then, suddenly, click, the latch popped loose. The door creaked open. I held my breath and reached for my flashlight, shining it into the dark space beyond. The room was empty. No furniture. No boxes. Just bare wooden walls and a single chair in the middle of the floor. The air inside was cold. Stale. Like no one had been inside for years. And then I saw it. The scratches. All over the inside of the door. Deep, uneven scratches. Like someone had been clawing at it from the inside. A chill ran through me. Then I noticed something even worse. The latch, the one that had been locked from the outside. There was another one on the inside. Someone had been locked in this room before, and they had tried to get out. I felt sick. I backed away, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I had to get out of there. I turned, and the door slammed shut. I lunged for the handle, pulling as hard as I could. It wouldn't budge. I banged on the door. "Let me out." Silence. Then soft shuffling sounds. Not outside. Inside the room with me. I spun around, my flashlight flickering. The beam landed on the chair. And then, it moved. Just a little. Just enough. I felt a wave of cold rush through me, like something was standing right next to me, watching. I threw myself against the door, screaming, "Let me out." The light in my flashlight flickered again. And then, click, the door swung open. I stumbled out, gasping for air. The hallway was empty. I grabbed my keys, my bag, and ran out of the cabin. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, speeding away down the dark road. I didn't tell Henry what happened. I just texted him, saying something came up and I had to leave early. He didn't ask any questions. But I still think about that room. Why was it locked? Who had been inside? And most importantly, who closed the door behind me? There is something unsettling about being alone in an unfamiliar place, especially when that place is deep in the woods. That feeling was with me the entire weekend I spent at a remote cabin, miles away from the nearest town. I had gone there to clear my mind, to escape from the stress of my everyday life. But what was supposed to be a peaceful retreat turned into a nightmare that still haunts me. I never saw the person watching me, but I know they were there. I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon. The sun was starting to set behind the trees, casting long shadows over the dirt road. The cabin itself was small and old, with a wooden porch and a stone chimney. It looked exactly like the pictures in the listing, isolated, surrounded by nothing but thick forest. I had rented it online from an older couple who lived in a town about an hour away. They had been friendly in their emails, giving me directions and assuring me that the cabin was the perfect place for some peace and quiet. That was exactly what I wanted. I parked my car and carried my bags inside. The inside of the cabin was simple, just one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a cozy living room with a fireplace. There were no neighbors, no cell service, and no distractions. Just the forest and me. Or so I thought. I spent the first evening settling in. I made dinner, read a book, and sat by the fireplace, enjoying the warmth. Outside, the woods were silent except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. At around 11 p.m., I decided to get some sleep. I locked the doors, turned off the lights, and climbed into bed. The cabin was quiet, almost too quiet. Then, in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. At first, I didn't know why. The cabin was still silent. No strange noises, no movement. But something felt off. Then I noticed it. The curtain. The bedroom had a single window, covered by a thin white curtain. And in the dim light of the moon, I could see it moving. Just slightly. Just enough to make my stomach drop. It was as if someone had just pulled it back, just a little, before letting it fall back into place. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I stared at the window, barely breathing. Nothing happened. No sound. No movement. I told myself it was the wind. The windows weren't the best quality. Maybe a draft had blown the curtain. I forced myself to lie back down, but it took me a long time to fall asleep. The next morning, I checked outside the cabin. I half expected to find footprints in the dirt beneath my window, but there was nothing, just fallen leaves and twigs. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I spent most of the day hiking through the woods, trying to distract myself. The fresh air helped a little, but by the time I got back to the cabin in the late afternoon, the feeling of being watched had returned. That night, as I was sitting on the couch reading, I heard something outside. A soft crunching sound. Footsteps. I froze, my heart pounding. I turned off the lamp, sitting completely still in the darkness. The footsteps stopped. I sat there for what felt like hours, listening. But there was nothing. Finally, I convinced myself it had been an animal. A deer, maybe. Something harmless. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching. I went to bed around midnight, but I didn't sleep well. Every sound outside made me tense up. Every shift of the wind against the trees made me think someone was moving outside. Then, sometime in the early hours of the morning, I woke up again. This time, there was no mistaking it. The curtain was moving. Not from the wind. Not from a draft. Someone was outside the window. I couldn't see them, but I knew. I could feel it. I stayed completely still, my breath caught in my throat. Then a shadow. For just a second, I saw it through the thin fabric of the curtain. A dark shape. A person. Standing right outside my window. I sat up quickly, reaching for my phone, only to remember that I had no service. I had never felt so helpless in my life. I wanted to run, to turn on every light and scare them away. But my body refused to move. I just sat there, frozen, staring at the curtain. Then, slowly, the shadow moved away. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. As soon as the sun came up, I forced myself to go outside and check around the cabin. I didn't really want to, but I needed to know. The ground beneath my window was disturbed. The dirt and leaves had been moved around, like someone had been standing there. My stomach twisted. I walked around to the back of the cabin and found something worse. The back door, the one I hadn't used since arriving, was unlocked. No, not just unlocked. Slightly open. I felt sick. Had I forgotten to lock it? No. I was sure I had, which meant someone had been inside. While I was sleeping, I didn't bother packing my things. I grabbed my car keys, ran to my car, and sped away from that cabin as fast as I could. I didn't stop driving until I was back in town, sitting in a crowded gas station parking lot, trying to calm my breathing. I called the owners from a payphone. I didn't tell them everything. I just said something had come up, and I had to leave early. They didn't seem surprised. I didn't ask why. I never went back to that cabin. And to this day, I still wonder, who was outside my window that night? And worse, were they ever inside the cabin with me? I don't think I'll ever go back to a cabin in the woods again. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. 3 days away from the noise of the city, a chance to clear my head and reset. I had rented a remote cabin online, somewhere deep in the mountains, far from any major roads or towns. The listing described it as the perfect escape for those who crave solitude. That's exactly what I had wanted. But I wasn't alone. Someone had been there before me, and they left something behind. The drive to the cabin was long and exhausting. The last 2 hours of the trip were spent on winding dirt roads that snaked through the dense forest. There were no other houses, no signs of civilization, just trees stretching endlessly in every direction. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already setting. The cabin itself was small and simple, made of old wood, with a stone chimney and a porch that creaked under my weight. It looked untouched, like no one had been there in years. I parked my car, grabbed my bags, and headed inside. The air was thick with the smell of aged wood and dust. Everything was as expected. A small living room, a kitchen with outdated appliances, a single bedroom, and a tiny bathroom. I should have felt relieved to finally be there. But something felt off. It wasn't anything obvious. Just a slight unease creeping into my chest, like the air in the cabin was too still. I shook it off. I was just tired from the drive. At least, that's what I told myself. That first night, I made a simple dinner, read a book by the fireplace, and went to bed early. The silence of the forest was strangely comforting. No sirens, no traffic, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I fell asleep easily. But when I woke up the next morning, I noticed something strange. There was a piece of paper on the floor near the front door. A small, folded note. I frowned, picking it up. Had I dropped it? I didn't remember bringing any paper with me. I unfolded it, my heartbeat quickening as I read the shaky, handwritten words. "You're not alone." My skin went cold. I looked around the cabin, half expecting someone to be standing there, watching me. But there was no one. The door was locked. The windows were closed. I tried to tell myself it was some kind of prank. Maybe the owners had left it behind as a joke. Maybe it had been tucked into an old book and had fallen out. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Someone had put it there. Someone had been in the cabin. I spent the rest of the morning checking the cabin, looking for any signs that someone had broken in. But the windows were intact. The doors were locked. There was no sign of forced entry. Still, the unease lingered. I tried to ignore it, spending the day hiking through the woods. The fresh air helped clear my mind, and by the time I got back to the cabin in the late afternoon, I convinced myself I had overreacted. But then I noticed something else. Something small. The chair in the living room had been moved. It was subtle, just slightly angled differently than before. But I knew I hadn't touched it. Had someone been inside while I was gone? I checked the door again. Still locked. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been here. Someone was watching me. That night, I locked every door, double-checked the windows, and kept a flashlight beside my bed. I barely slept. Every creak, every whisper of wind against the cabin made my heart pound. But nothing happened. No strange noises. No movement outside. When the sun finally rose, I let out a breath of relief. Then I saw it. Another piece of paper. It was sitting on the kitchen counter. I hadn't put it there. My hands trembled as I unfolded it, my stomach twisting as I read the words. Don't look outside. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to, but I had to. I moved slowly toward the window, my pulse hammering in my ears. I peered out, expecting to see something. But there was nothing. Just the empty forest. At least, that's what I thought, until I noticed it. A single footprint in the dirt. Right outside the window. I wanted to leave. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out of there. But it was late, and the nearest town was hours away. Driving through those dark, winding forest roads at night didn't seem any safer. So I stayed, but I didn't sleep. I sat in bed, gripping a flashlight, listening to every sound outside. Sometime past midnight, I heard it. A soft tapping. It was faint, barely there. But I knew exactly where it was coming from. The window. The one right beside my bed. I held my breath, my grip tightening around the flashlight. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, like someone was testing to see if I'd react. I didn't move. Then silence. The tapping stopped. I lay there, frozen, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have drifted off. When I woke up, the first thing I saw was the third note. It was sitting on the nightstand beside my bed. I saw you. I didn't waste another second. I grabbed my bag, my keys, and practically ran out of the cabin. I didn't care about packing up properly. I didn't care about leaving the place a mess. I just needed to get out. As I started my car, I stole one last glance at the cabin. That's when I saw it. In the dirt near the porch was a fourth note. It was folded neatly, placed right where I would see it before leaving. I knew I shouldn't, but I had to. I got out of the car, heart pounding, and picked up the note with shaking hands. I unfolded it, my stomach twisting into knots as I read the final message. See you soon. I never looked back. I sped down the dirt roads, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. I checked into a motel, locked the door, and barely slept that night. The next morning, I called the owners of the cabin. I told them something had happened, but I didn't go into detail. I just said I wouldn't be staying the full 3 days. They didn't sound surprised. I asked if anyone else had keys to the cabin, if someone could have been inside while I was there. The owner was silent for a moment. Then he sighed and said, "You're not the first person to leave early." I asked what he meant. He hesitated before saying, "Someone keeps leaving notes, but we've never caught them." I felt sick. I asked why they still rented the place out if they knew something was wrong. "We need the money," he said simply. That was the last time I spoke to him. I never went back. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still think about that last note. See you soon. I don't know who left those notes. I don't know if they followed me. But I still wake up sometimes, feeling like I'm being watched. I should have turned back. From the very first moment I stepped into that cabin, something felt wrong. It was supposed to be a simple trip. A weekend in the mountains, away from the city, away from work, away from stress. I booked a cabin online, just a small, rustic place near a lake. No TV, no Wi-Fi, just peace and quiet. But I made a mistake. A small one. A simple mix-up. I went to the wrong cabin, and someone else knew I was there. The drive up the mountain was long and slow. The roads were winding, barely wide enough for one car, and the deeper I went into the forest, the fewer signs of civilization I saw. By the time I reached the area where the cabin was supposed to be, it was almost dark. I checked my phone for the directions one last time, but there was no signal, no GPS, just a vague description of where the cabin was located. I followed the dirt road until I spotted it, a small, weathered wooden cabin tucked between the trees. A single porch light flickered weakly. That had to be it. I parked, grabbed my bag, and made my way to the front door. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures, old but sturdy, with a simple porch and a stone chimney. I found the key where the owner said it would be, under a loose plank on the porch. As I unlocked the door and stepped inside, I felt a wave of relief. I had made it, or so I thought. The inside of the cabin was basic. One small room with a bed, a table, a fireplace, and a tiny kitchen area. There was a door that led to the bathroom and another leading to a storage closet. Everything seemed fine. At first, I set my bag down, took a deep breath, and looked around. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and dust. The floors creaked under my weight as I walked toward the small table near the fireplace. That's when I noticed it. A mug. It was sitting on the table, still half full of coffee. The liquid was dark and still, but something about it made my stomach twist. I hadn't made coffee. Had the last guest forgotten to clean up? Maybe the owner had been here earlier? I reached out, touching the side of the mug. It was warm. Someone had been here. Recently. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe the owner had come to check on the place before I arrived. Maybe they had made coffee and left without finishing it. I tried to ignore the unease creeping into my chest. But then I noticed something else. The bed was messy. The blankets were rumpled, the pillows slightly indented, like someone had been lying there. I stood frozen in place, staring at the unmade bed. The listing had said the cabin would be clean and ready for my arrival. But this wasn't clean. This wasn't ready. This looked like someone had just been here. Maybe they still were. I turned around, my heart pounding. The cabin was silent. Too silent. I forced myself to check the bathroom. It was empty. The closet? Also empty. I let out a breath, laughing at myself. I was being paranoid. It was just an old cabin. Maybe the owner forgot to tidy up after the last guest. I decided to settle in. I unpacked a few things, made a small dinner, and tried to relax. But the feeling never left me. And later that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it. Footsteps. Soft. Slow. Right outside the cabin. I held my breath, my body going stiff. The footsteps moved along the porch, creaking the wooden planks. Someone was out there. I stayed completely still, my heart thudding against my ribs. Then silence. Minutes passed. Nothing. Maybe it was an animal? A deer or a raccoon. I kept telling myself that over and over, until I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. I woke up at dawn, exhausted and tense. The cabin was cold, the fire having burned out during the night. I got up, rubbing my arms, and walked to the front door to check outside. And then I froze. The door was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it the night before. My hands trembled as I slowly turned the knob. The door creaked open, revealing the empty porch. The forest was still, bathed in pale morning light. But something was different. The doormat had been moved. It was supposed to be centered in front of the door, but now it was shifted to the side, like someone had stepped on it, or lifted it. A chill ran down my spine. I crouched down and slowly lifted the mat. Underneath it was a single key, not the one I had used. This one was old and rusted. It hadn't been there the day before. I stood up quickly, my breath shaky. Someone had been here. Someone had been inside, and they had left a key. But why? I couldn't stay. I grabbed my things and rushed to my car. I didn't even care about breakfast. I just needed to get out. As I started driving, my phone finally got a signal. Messages flooded in, one from the owner of the cabin I had actually rented. It read, "Hey, just checking in. Haven't heard from you. Are you okay? You never arrived at the cabin." I felt my stomach drop. I pulled over, my hands shaking, and checked the booking details again. And then I saw it. I had gone to the wrong cabin. My cabin was 2 miles down the road. I had spent the entire night in someone else's home. But if the cabin wasn't a rental, then whose coffee had that been? Whose bed had I slept in? And most importantly, who had been watching me? I didn't go back. I didn't check out the real cabin. I just drove straight home, shaking the entire way. I called the rental owner later and apologized, making up an excuse about car trouble. Then I asked them, casually, if they knew anything about the other cabin up the road. There was a pause. Then the owner said, "There's no other cabin." I felt the blood drain from my face. I insisted the cabin was there. I had stayed in it. Another pause. Then, in a quiet voice, the owner said, "That cabin burned down 10 years ago." I hung up the phone. I never went back. I don't know whose cabin I stayed in. I don't know who was watching me. And I don't know what would have happened if I had stayed another night. I needed a break. Life had been exhausting, work stress, personal issues, and the constant noise of the city. I wanted nothing more than to get away from it all, even if just for a few days. That's why I booked a small, isolated cabin deep in the woods. It was perfect. No Wi-Fi, no cell signal, no distractions. Just me, the trees, and silence. I packed my car with enough food and supplies for 3 nights and hit the road early in the morning. The drive was long, but as I left the highways behind and entered the dense forest, I felt relieved. The air smelled fresh, the trees stood tall, and the world finally felt peaceful. I had no idea that by the end of the trip, I would be praying for noise. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already beginning to set. The dirt road leading up to it was rough, with deep potholes and overgrown weeds. The cabin itself looked old but sturdy, small, wooden, with a covered porch and a chimney on the side. I parked my car, grabbed my bags, and walked up to the front door. The key was exactly where the owner said it would be, under a loose brick on the porch. Unlocking the door, I stepped inside and took a deep breath. The inside was simple: one large room with a bed, a small kitchen, a wooden table, and a fireplace. A single door led to the bathroom, and another to a storage closet. Everything seemed normal. I put my bags down, lit a few candles since there was no electricity, and started a fire in the fireplace. The warmth filled the room quickly, and for the first time in months, I felt relaxed. But that feeling didn't last long. After eating a simple dinner, I settled into bed with a book. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the occasional creak of the wooden walls as the temperature outside dropped. At some point, I fell asleep, and that's when I heard it: laughter. I woke up instantly, my heart racing. The room was dark except for the dim glow of the dying fire. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. Maybe I had been dreaming. Then I heard it again. Soft, childlike. It came from outside the cabin. I sat up in bed, straining my ears. The laughter was distant but clear, echoing through the trees. It didn't sound like a normal, happy laugh. It was slow, unnatural, like someone pretending to be a child. My stomach twisted. There was no reason for a child to be out here, in the middle of the forest, in the dead of night. I reached for my flashlight and hesitated. Did I really want to look outside? The laughter stopped. Silence. I waited for what felt like hours, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I convinced myself it was the wind or some kind of animal. Maybe even a trick of my own tired mind. I lay back down, keeping the flashlight close, and somehow managed to fall asleep again. The next day, I woke up feeling uneasy. The laughter from the night before still haunted me, but in the daylight, it felt less terrifying. I stepped outside to get some fresh air, hoping the sunlight would help me shake off the fear. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Small ones like those of a child. They led from the edge of the forest to my cabin porch. And then they stopped. There were no footprints leading away. Whoever, or whatever, had walked up to my cabin last night never left. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe an animal? Maybe the prints were old. Maybe I had simply not noticed them when I arrived. I forced myself to ignore the fear creeping into my chest. I spent the day hiking and trying to clear my mind. By the time I returned, the sun was already setting. I told myself tonight would be different. I was wrong. I locked the door. I bolted the windows. I sat by the fireplace, listening to the silence, waiting. For hours, nothing happened. And then, the laughter came back. This time, it was closer. Right outside the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands shaking. My heart pounded as I stood up and slowly walked to the window. I took a deep breath and shined the light outside. Nothing. The porch was empty. The trees were still. But the moment I turned the flashlight off, the laughter started again. Right by the window. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. Something was out there, watching me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, wide-eyed, waiting for the morning. The laughter didn't stop until just before dawn. I wanted to leave. I should have left. But my pride, my stupid, stubborn pride, kept me there. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I was overreacting. I decided to stay one more night. That was the biggest mistake of my life. As the sun set, I locked myself inside, armed with a kitchen knife. The fire burned brightly, casting long shadows across the cabin walls. Then the knocking started. Soft taps, coming from the front door. I held my breath, gripping the knife tighter. Then the back window. Knock, knock, knock. Then the closet door inside the cabin. I spun around, my heart nearly stopping. Something was inside with me. The closet door was closed, just as it had been all day. But now, I wasn't sure. Had I checked it earlier? Had it always been slightly open? I took a step closer. The fire crackled behind me. My own breathing sounded too loud. I reached for the doorknob, my fingers trembling. Then, the laughter exploded from inside. I screamed, stumbling backward. The door didn't move. Nothing came out, but the laughter kept going. Louder, shrill, twisted. I ran. I grabbed my keys, flung open the front door, and sprinted to my car. As I fumbled to unlock it, I risked one last glance at the cabin. And that's when I saw it. Through the window, staring at me from inside the cabin, a small, pale face. A child, smiling, still laughing. I don't remember much after that. I sped down the dark road, barely able to see through my tears. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I checked into a motel and locked myself in the bathroom, shaking uncontrollably. The next day, I called the owner and told him I had left early. I didn't explain why. I never told anyone what happened. But sometimes late at night, when everything is quiet, I swear I can still hear it. That horrible, twisted laughter. And I always wonder, what would have happened if I had opened the closet? I needed some time alone. Life had been overwhelming. Work stress, personal problems, and the constant noise of the city. My friend Mark told me about a cabin he had rented before, deep in the woods, perfect for relaxing. It's quiet, private, and no one goes out there, he said. You'll love it. That was exactly what I needed. I booked the cabin for the weekend, packed my bags, and drove out early Friday morning. The drive was peaceful at first, long roads surrounded by trees, no traffic, no distractions. As I got closer, the paved roads turned into dirt paths, and my phone lost signal. It felt good to be disconnected. But as I got closer to the cabin, something felt off. The cabin looked just like the pictures, small, wooden, with a porch and a chimney on the side. It was surrounded by tall trees, and there were no other houses nearby. But something felt strange. The front door was unlocked. I hesitated. Maybe the cleaning crew forgot to lock it after the last guest? I pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside. The cabin was simple, one big room with a bed, a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a door leading to the bathroom. A closet sat in the corner. Everything looked clean, but there was a strange smell in the air, like something old. Stale. I shook it off and brought my bags inside. I checked the cabin, windows locked, bathroom empty, closet empty. I was alone. At least, I thought I was. That evening, I made dinner, started a fire, and settled in with a book. The cabin was quiet, except for the occasional creak of the wooden walls. By midnight, I was exhausted. I locked the front door, checked the windows again, and went to bed. I woke up suddenly. Something was different. The fire was out. The room was colder. And then I heard it. A soft shuffle, like footsteps. Inside the cabin, I held my breath. My heart pounded in my chest. I reached for my flashlight, slowly turning it on. The room was empty. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe the wood was just settling. I forced myself to close my eyes. And then, the sound came again. A quiet movement. A shift of weight. But this time, it came from the closet. I stared at the closed door, my stomach twisting in fear. Had I checked inside before bed? Had the door been open or closed earlier? I pulled the blanket up and forced myself to stay still. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I told myself I had imagined it. I got up, made coffee, and walked around the cabin, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The closet door was open, just a few inches. I knew I had closed it the night before, hadn't I? I grabbed my flashlight and walked slowly toward the closet. I took a deep breath, grabbed the handle, and yanked the door open. Nothing. Just an empty space with some old shelves. I exhaled in relief. Maybe the door was loose. Maybe the wind had pushed it open. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't really alone. That evening, I tried to relax. I played some music, cooked a nice meal, and told myself I was just overthinking things. By the time I got into bed, I felt a little better. But that didn't last long. At exactly midnight, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't footsteps. It was breathing. Soft. Shallow. Coming from inside the room. I gripped my flashlight with shaking hands and turned it on. The room looked the same. Except, The closet door was open again, wider this time. I stared at it, my heart slamming against my ribs. Someone was in here. I forced myself to move. I got out of bed, walked to the closet, and shut the door hard. Then I dragged the heavy wooden chair from the kitchen and wedged it under the doorknob. If something was inside, it wasn't coming out now. I sat awake for hours, gripping the flashlight, waiting, listening. At some point, I must have fallen asleep. When I woke up, the sun was rising. The chair was still under the doorknob. The closet was still shut. Had I imagined it all? I wanted to believe that, until I looked at the floor and saw the footprints, small, border, leading from the closet to my bed. I should have left right then, but I didn't. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe the footprints had been there before, and I just hadn't noticed. I spent the day outside, hiking near the cabin, trying to distract myself. But no matter how far I walked, I felt like I was being watched, like something was waiting for me to come back. When the sun started to set, my stomach twisted. I did not want to go back inside. But where else could I go? That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I locked the door, bolted the windows, and sat by the fire with my flashlight and knife in hand, waiting. Midnight came. The fire crackled. The wind howled outside. And then, a single knock. Not at the front door. At the closet. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. The knock came again. Then the handle twisted. I grabbed the chair and pushed it harder against the door. The handle rattled, harder this time. Something wanted out. Then, silence. The air in the cabin felt heavy, thick, like something was waiting. Then, a whisper. Soft. Close. Let me out. I ran. I grabbed my keys, flung open the front door, and sprinted to my car. As I fumbled with the lock, I dared to look back. Through the window, behind the glass, a shadow, tall, watching me, smiling. I didn't stay to see what happened next. I jumped in my car and sped away, never looking back. The next day, I called Mark and told him what happened. He went silent. Then he said, "I never told you this, but I only stayed one night when I rented that cabin." "Why?" I asked. He took a deep breath. "I woke up to the closet door open. Neither of us ever went back. And sometimes late at night, I wonder, what would have happened if I had let it out?" I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. My friend Alex had invited me to stay at his family's old hunting cabin deep in the woods. He and his brother had planned a weekend of fishing, grilling, and just getting away from city life. It sounded perfect. The drive took hours. As we got closer, the roads became narrow, winding through thick forests. There were no streetlights, no houses, just trees stretching endlessly in every direction. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was already setting. It was a small, simple wooden structure with a tin roof and a front porch. There was a single dirt road leading to it, and beyond that, nothing but wilderness. I felt a slight unease as I stepped out of the car. Something about the place felt wrong, but I ignored it. This was just a cabin, nothing more. Inside, the cabin was cozy but old. Wooden walls, a stone fireplace, and a few worn-out couches. The kitchen was small, and there were only 2 bedrooms. We unpacked, made some food, and spent the evening playing cards and drinking beer. Everything was fine, until I stepped outside to get some fresh air. That's when I saw it. Blood. A single red smear on the front door. My stomach tightened. I reached out and touched it. It was dry, dark, and looked like it had been there for a while. "Hey, Alex," I called. "Did you see this?" He came over, frowning. "What?" I pointed at the stain. His face changed. For a moment, he looked uneasy. Then he forced a chuckle. "Oh, that? It's probably from when my dad and uncle hunted here last fall. They skinned a deer out front." I nodded slowly, but something felt off. Why would someone wipe animal blood on the door? I tried to forget about it. We went back inside, had a few more drinks, and eventually Alex's brother, Matt, went to bed. Alex and I stayed up talking for a while. The fire crackled, and the woods outside were completely silent. Then, a knock. It was faint, almost too soft to hear. We both froze. Knock, knock, knock. I turned to Alex. His face had gone pale. "It's probably Matt messing with us," he said, standing up. He walked to the door and swung it open. No one was there. The trees stood still, the dirt road was empty, and the night air was freezing. Alex cursed under his breath and closed the door. "Probably the wind," he muttered, forcing a smile. I didn't believe him. I went to bed feeling uneasy. The bedroom was small, with an old wooden bed and a single window looking out into the trees. The wind howled outside, rattling the thin walls of the cabin. I tried to sleep. Then, a sound, a low scraping noise, like something dragging against the wood outside. I held my breath. The noise moved, slow and deliberate, from one side of the cabin to the other. I sat up, heart pounding. Footsteps, light, slow, circling the cabin. I reached for my phone, no signal. The time read 3:12 a.m. I listened, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped right outside my window. I didn't move. I didn't dare look. For a long time, there was only silence. Then, a long, slow tap against the glass. Tap, tap, tap. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay still. The tapping stopped. The footsteps moved away. Then nothing. I stayed awake until morning. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside. My stomach dropped. On the cabin door, right where the old bloodstain had been, a fresh, bloody handprint. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. "Alex!" I shouted. He ran outside, saw what I was pointing at, and froze. "That," he started but stopped. The blood was still wet. He turned and ran toward Matt's room, throwing the door open. Matt was still asleep. Alive. Safe. Which meant someone else had been here. And they had been right outside my window last night. We spent the morning searching the area. No footprints. No signs of anyone. It didn't make sense. But something else was wrong. One of the knives from the kitchen was missing. Alex swore he had left it on the counter the night before. Now it was gone. I felt sick. Someone had been inside the cabin, watching us. We had to leave. But Matt was still half asleep, insisting we were overreacting. So we stayed. Big mistake. By the time the sun set, I was on edge. I locked every door and window, made sure the fireplace was burning bright, and kept a kitchen knife beside my bed. But none of it made me feel safe. At exactly midnight, I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. Soft, slow, right on the window beside my bed. I clenched my jaw. I wouldn't run. I wouldn't show fear. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it on, aiming it at the window. Nothing. Just trees and darkness. I let out a shaky breath. Then, the closet door behind me creaked open. I spun around, my heart nearly stopping. The closet was empty, but something felt wrong, like I wasn't alone. I reached for the doorknob, and then, outside the window, something moved. Just a shadow. Tall. Watching. I didn't move. I just stared, my hands gripping the knife. For a long time, the shadow didn't move either. Then, it grinned. Not a person. Not a trick of the light. A mouth. Too wide. Too sharp. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair. The shadow moved fast, too fast. And then it was gone. I didn't wait. I grabbed my bag, stormed into the other room, and yelled, "We're leaving. Now." Alex and Matt saw my face and didn't argue. We grabbed our things, ran to the truck, and threw everything inside. As Alex turned the key, I risked one last glance at the cabin. Something was standing on the porch, watching us. Tall, thin, face stretched into that same awful grin. But the worst part, it was holding the missing knife. Alex slammed the gas pedal, and we tore down the dirt road, not stopping until we hit the main highway. We never went back. Alex's family put the cabin up for sale, but no one bought it. A year later, a storm knocked it down. But sometimes I still dream about that place. And in those dreams, I see the door, and the blood on it, and I hear the tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway, the kind of break I needed after weeks of work stress. I was tired, drained, and desperate for some solitude. Maggie, my old college friend, had been planning the trip for months. Her family owned a cabin in the woods just outside the small town of Pine Ridge, and she'd invited me to come with her. The idea of escaping the hustle of city life for a few days in the middle of nature seemed like the perfect opportunity to recharge. The cabin was isolated, tucked away in the woods, far from any civilization. Maggie said it was the perfect spot to unwind, and that she'd done it many times before. It wasn't fancy, just a small two-story structure with a stone fireplace and wooden walls. It didn't need to be anything else. When I arrived, Maggie greeted me with a warm hug and a broad smile. She seemed excited to have me there, and I could tell she was looking forward to the break as much as I was. We took her car and drove out of town, the road getting narrower as we went deeper into the forest. Trees crowded on either side, their tall trunks casting shadows over the road. Maggie and I talked the whole way, catching up on life, sharing stories, and laughing about old memories. But the deeper we drove, the more I began to feel uneasy. It wasn't fear exactly, it was just a strange feeling, like something wasn't quite right. "I swear the road gets narrower every time I come here," Maggie said with a nervous laugh. "It's like it's trying to keep us out." I joked, trying to lighten the mood, but the unease stayed with me. We finally arrived at the cabin, just as the sun was setting. It was beautiful in its own way, surrounded by towering trees and the sounds of the wilderness. The only noise was the rustling of leaves in the wind. We unloaded our things and entered the cabin, the smell of old wood and pine filling the air. It was cozy and rustic, with a fireplace in the center of the room and a couple of old couches arranged around it. The day had been long, so we decided to relax with some drinks, listening to music and talking about everything that had happened since we last saw each other. As the night grew darker, we moved to the porch, enjoying the quiet of the woods around us. It was getting late, and the cold night air had started to seep in. The woods outside were silent, the only sounds the occasional chirp of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. We'd finished our drinks and decided to go inside, but something made me stop for a moment. A noise, a rustle in the trees. I glanced around, but the darkness made it hard to see anything beyond the edge of the porch. It was probably an animal, just the wind, I told myself. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought, and went back inside. Maggie was already preparing to go to bed. She yawned and stretched, her tired eyes looking out the window. "I always forget how quiet it gets out here at night," she said softly. "Yeah, it's kind of eerie," I replied. But I didn't mean it in a creepy way, just that the stillness was different from anything I was used to in the city. We turned off the lights, and I climbed into the bed Maggie had set up for me in the guest room. The darkness was thick, pressing against the walls of the cabin. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the night. The wind outside, the occasional creak of the old wood, and something else. A sound, far off in the distance. A soft, eerie whisper, like someone calling my name. I froze, unsure if I'd actually heard it, or if my mind was playing tricks on me. But then it came again, faint but clear. "Help, please." I sat up, heart racing. The voice sounded far away, but close enough that I could have sworn it was right outside the window. I didn't move. I wanted to, but something kept me frozen in place. Was it just the wind, or was someone really out there? After a long moment, I decided to get up and look. I pulled on my jacket and went out to the porch, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. The night was colder now, the woods surrounding the cabin looking even darker than before. "Maggie," I called quietly, but there was no answer. I glanced around the porch, feeling exposed in the open air. The woods were still and silent, the trees towering over the cabin like dark sentinels. I waited a moment longer, my breath coming in shallow gasps, but no voice came back. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like something was watching me. I rushed back inside, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I told Maggie about the strange voice I'd heard. She just laughed it off, saying it was probably just the wind or my imagination. She was so easygoing, and I envied her ability to brush off strange things like that. But something still nagged at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something out there, something in the woods. That afternoon, we decided to take a walk. Maggie was excited to show me the nearby lake, a beautiful spot she loved to visit whenever she came up to the cabin. We grabbed our jackets and headed out, following a narrow trail that wound through the trees. The sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. But as we walked deeper into the woods, I started to feel that strange unease again. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint, just a sense that something was off. Maybe it was just the isolation. After all, we were miles away from the nearest neighbor. The trail led us to the lake, a calm, still body of water surrounded by tall trees. The sun glinted off the surface, and I breathed a sigh of relief. For a moment, it was peaceful, and I began to relax. But then Maggie stopped. She looked off into the trees, her expression suddenly serious. "What's wrong?" I asked. She didn't answer at first. Instead, she turned her head, scanning the area. "I thought I saw something," she said slowly. Over there. I followed her gaze. The trees were dense, the shadows deep, but I couldn't see anything unusual. Probably just a deer, I said, trying to reassure her. But Maggie was still staring into the woods. No, it wasn't an animal, she muttered. I don't know what it was. I felt a chill run down my spine. The atmosphere was different now, and my unease returned in full force. That evening, we sat by the fire in the cabin, the glow of the flames flickering against the walls. We were trying to shake off the weird feeling from earlier, but it wasn't easy. Maggie was unusually quiet, and I could tell she was just as unsettled as I was. Around midnight, we decided to turn in. I was still feeling that nagging sense of dread, but I pushed it aside, convinced it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. I lay in bed, trying to fall asleep, but the silence was suffocating. The wind had died down, and the usual nighttime sounds of the forest were eerily absent. Then I heard it again, the faint whisper. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. Help, please. This time, I knew it wasn't the wind. It was too clear, too real. It was coming from somewhere close, just outside the cabin. I jumped out of bed and ran to the window. Through the darkness, I saw a figure standing in the trees. A woman, tall and thin, her face hidden in shadow. She stood still, watching the cabin, her body barely moving. I felt a shiver run down my spine, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Then, without warning, she began to walk. Slowly, deliberately toward the cabin. I backed away from the window, heart racing. Maggie, I whispered urgently, but she didn't answer. She was already asleep. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but the signal was gone. The silence outside was overwhelming. The woman was still coming closer. I had to get Maggie up. We had to leave. I rushed to her room and shook her awake. Maggie, wake up. There's someone outside. Her eyes snapped open, and she blinked in confusion. What are you talking about? The woman in the woods. I whispered urgently. She's right outside. Maggie got out of bed and went to the window. For a moment, I thought she'd see her too. But then she turned back, shaking her head. There's nothing out there, she said calmly. I couldn't believe it, but the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. The woman was out there, and we weren't alone in the woods anymore. The next morning, we packed up and left. I didn't care what Maggie said about the woman. I couldn't stay there any longer. We drove back to town, both of us silent the whole way, the memory of that figure in the woods haunting me. When we got back to the cabin, Maggie's family was there, and they were confused when we told them what had happened. Maggie laughed it off, trying to convince them it was just our imagination. But I knew what I saw, and as we left Pine Ridge behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching, waiting. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway. Just a few days in a secluded cabin, away from the noise of the city and the weight of everyday life. No work emails, no social media notifications, no distractions, just peace and quiet. I had been looking forward to it for weeks. After a hectic few months at the office, I was finally going to spend some quality time alone, surrounded by nature. The cabin was a few hours' drive from the city, nestled deep in the woods, far enough away from civilization to feel truly isolated. When I first arrived, everything seemed perfect. The air was fresh and crisp, the trees towering above the cabin like silent guardians. The cabin itself was small but cozy, with a stone fireplace, a big leather armchair, and a large window that overlooked the forest. I couldn't wait to start reading my book, sip hot tea, and just unwind. I'd rented the cabin for a few days, expecting it to be a peaceful retreat. The owner of the cabin had warned me about the lack of cell phone service and the spotty internet, but I was relieved by that. I didn't want to be interrupted by calls, emails, or messages. The first night was everything I hoped for. I sat by the fire, reading a mystery novel, the crackling of the logs filling the silence. I cooked a simple dinner, just a pot of soup, and settled in for the night. The cabin creaked in the wind, and the sound of distant branches rustling outside added a touch of eerie charm to the whole experience. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but I didn't mind. It was peaceful. The next day, I woke up early to the sound of birds chirping and the smell of pine in the air. I brewed some coffee and stepped outside, taking in the beauty of the woods. There was a small trail leading into the forest, and I decided to explore it. I spent the morning walking, the only sound the crunching of leaves beneath my boots. As I walked deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't a feeling I could easily explain, just a strange sense of unease that settled over me as I moved further away from the cabin. I turned around a few times to look back, but the cabin was nowhere in sight. I figured it was just my imagination running wild and kept walking. By midday, I had reached a small clearing in the woods. It was a perfect spot to stop and eat the lunch I'd packed. I sat on a large rock, unpacking my sandwich and watching the forest around me. The air was still, and the trees seemed to be holding their breath. I finished my lunch, packed up, and began the walk back to the cabin. That was when I noticed something strange. There was a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was far enough away that I couldn't make out any details, but the figure was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes. I froze, unsure of what to do. Was it another hiker? A local? Someone who had lost their way? I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the figure. Then, without any warning, it turned and disappeared into the trees. I didn't know why, but something about it felt wrong. My heart was racing, and I immediately began walking back toward the cabin, my pace quickening as I went. The walk back felt longer than it had earlier, and the strange feeling of being watched returned, stronger this time. When I finally reached the cabin, I locked the door behind me, trying to push the unease out of my mind. I didn't want to overthink it. It was probably just someone else enjoying the woods, right? That evening, as the sun began to set, I decided to relax by the fire again. I poured myself a glass of wine and grabbed my book, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the figure in the woods. I tried to distract myself, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Around 9 p.m., the power went out. It wasn't unexpected. The cabin was in a remote location, and power outages were common. I lit a few candles and settled into the armchair, trying to make the best of the situation. The wind was picking up outside, rattling the windows. The silence of the cabin was almost suffocating now, broken only by the occasional gust of wind. Then the phone rang. I froze. The cabin's landline phone had been an old, dusty thing. I hadn't even checked if it worked when I arrived. But now it was ringing, its shrill tone cutting through the silence of the cabin. I hesitated. Who could be calling me out here? I was miles from the nearest town, and there were no neighbors for miles. It was strange, unsettling even. But curiosity got the better of me, and I walked over to the phone, picking up the receiver. "Hello," I said, my voice shaky. There was a pause. Silence on the other end. Then a low, raspy voice came through the line. "Get out of the cabin." I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice was soft but chilling, as if it had come from a long distance away. I didn't know who was calling or how they knew I was there, but the command was clear. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice trembling. Another pause, then the voice came again, more insistent this time. "Get out now." I looked around the cabin, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. Who would be calling me in the middle of nowhere? And why were they telling me to leave? "Are you still there?" the voice asked, and I could hear the faintest hint of laughter in their tone. "Who are you?" I demanded again, but the line went dead. The phone clicked, and I was left holding the receiver in the silence of the cabin. I stared at the phone, my pulse racing. My mind was running wild with possibilities. Was it some prank? Was someone playing a joke on me? Or was there something more sinister at play? I tried to shake the feeling off, but it was impossible. I had the overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. Someone was out there, watching me. I spent the rest of the night nervously checking the windows, making sure the doors were locked, and keeping the lights on. The wind howled outside, and the trees creaked, but I couldn't relax. I kept imagining that I heard footsteps, faint rustling noises, just beyond the cabin's walls. Around midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys and decided to drive back to the nearest town, even though it would take me hours to get there. I couldn't stay in that cabin, not with the phone call still echoing in my head. I was almost to the door when I heard it. A knock. It was soft at first, but it grew louder and more insistent, coming from the front door. I froze, my heart racing once again. I didn't move. I didn't say a word. The knock came again, followed by a voice. "Open the door." "It's me." It was the same voice from the phone call. But how could that be? I hadn't seen anyone when I checked outside earlier, and the cabin was miles from any other homes or cabins. I felt my legs go weak beneath me. The voice sounded so close now, just outside the door. But I couldn't bring myself to open it. I held my breath, waiting, but there was no sound. No more knocking. No more voice. just the howling wind outside and the silence within. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, every rustle in the trees made my heart race. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, trying to ignore the dread gnawing at my insides. When the sun finally rose, I gathered my things and left. I didn't care about the cost of the cabin or the rest of my stay. I just needed to get out of there. The drive back to the city was long and exhausting, but I didn't care. I didn't want to be anywhere near that cabin again. To this day, I have no idea who called me that night or why, and I've never been back to that cabin. But I'll never forget the voice. The voice that told me to get out, and the voice that knocked on my door. Whoever, or whatever, it was, I pray I never meet them again.